Well, hello there once again, everybody, and welcome back to my crash course in formal logic. In this third part in our series, we're going to be studying the crucial concepts of validity, strength, soundness, and cogency. So you want to watch this video several times, I think. However, this is a crash course. Hopefully you'll be reviewing the material presented in each of these lectures more than once. Now, speaking of review, now would be a very nice time for a review because you've been covering a whole bunch of lessons in the past two sections of this course, which are going to be relevant to this third section of the course. It's quite a mouthful to go back over. But we said early on that there were two conditions of an argument. You have to have a set of premises or reasons, and those factual claims are not determined by logic. Rather, there's a second claim, the inference claim, the claim that support has been offered, and whether or not support really is there is decided by logic. Now, it immediately follows that a set of factual claims without an inference claim amounts to a non-argument. We said that in Lesson 1. Whereas a set of factual claims with the claim of support or an inference, that's when you get argumentation in our sense of the term argument. So, logic is actually the science of support, whether or not the premises back the conclusion, not the science of truth. Alternatively, you said, logic is the science that tells us whether or not premises and conclusions enjoy the right inference or the right hookup between one another. Whether or not the premises or conclusions are actually true is a different matter altogether. So, we said with respect to this appropriateness of a hookup between premises and conclusions, there's more than one way they can be linked. They can be linked deductively or inductively. And we also gave you an acronym so that you could memorize the difference between the inference claim that an arguer is making. Is the arguer allowing that additional premises can add more support to their conclusion, or are they allowing that there's novel information in the conclusion that wasn't there in the premises? Is the arguer saying that there's a structure to the argument that preserves truth on the way from the premises to the conclusion, or are they allowing that support admits of degree as opposed to, say, being an all or nothing matter? All of these issues go into inference claims. Now, inference claims are very important to logic, we said, and to argumentation. They're the most important element of an argument, decided by logic, and if they're wrong, junk the argument. And the strength of such a claim for an argument divided our arguments into inductive and deductive styles or types of arguments. So bear in mind, we said early on, this distinction between inductive and deductive is not the same as a distinction between good and bad or strong and weak arguments. All we've said so far in this course is that support can come in two forms, and attacks on arguments must be appropriate to the degree of support that they purported to give to their conclusions. Well, so by now you're probably wondering, then what is the relevance of all this? What does this inductive-deductive talk have to do with evaluating arguments? Well, that's really the subject for this third part in our logic series. There are two key elements to any argument. Are the premises true? Yes. But the crucial point is to what degree do those premises support the conclusion? That's what logic's there to help you with. So initially, degree of support is the key to evaluating arguments. We're going to use this little flow chart. Once you know that an argument is set forward, you want to know whether it's inductive or deductive. That is to say, you want to know the type of argument that you're dealing with and then move on to the key of degree. Whether or not a person's claiming an inductive or deductive degree of strength for their conclusion is the issue of the inference's strength. Was the degree of support claimed actually achieved? Now, once you evaluate an inference's strength, only after that can you go on to talk about whether or not its factual claims were true. So, once you go through this flow chart, you're going to have three simple steps. What is the type of the argument, the inference's strength, and only lastly, whether or not its factual claims held up. Now, logic, we said, can help you evaluate argument types and inference's strengths, but whether or not the premises are true or false, that's up to you to decide. The key point for now is this. The first and most important issue with respect to argument evaluation is evaluating its reasoning and inference. And whether or not its factual claims were correct is the secondary concern, the lowest rung on our little flow chart. So if you want to know what the relevance of all this is and what does the inductive-deductive distinction have to do with evaluating arguments, that's what gets us running on our flow chart. Basically, once you know that an argument has been presented, it's all a game of plinko, really. Figure out which direction you wind up on this chart, and obviously as you look at the bottom, cogent and sound arguments are the ones that we want to put some weight into and buy into. So once you know that you've got an argument on hand, check to see if it's deductive and whether its degree of support was as strong as claimed. Lastly, check its premises to see if it was sound. And the same thing goes when you're dealing with the left-hand form of this particular flowchart. What you want to do, make sure you're dealing with an argument, and if it's of the inductive variety, make sure a strong inductive inference was present. Then finally check the argument's factual claims to see if it was in fact cogent. Now I want to talk in more detail about what happens on the right-hand side of our little flowchart as we just saw. I want to talk about deductive inferences. Before I just talked about inferences of that sort being successful or not, or being fallacious or not. Here I want to precise my language. I want to talk about validity versus invalidity. A valid deductive argument is the successful deductive inference. That's when the deductive inference claim holds up. It is impossible for the conclusion to be false given that the premises are true. An invalid deductive argument is one in which the deductive inference claim did not hold up. There remains a possibility of a conclusion being false, even assuming the truth of the premises. The thing is, if you have a valid argument, it has a valid form or shape. It's set up so that the truth of the premises will be funneled into the conclusion, so to speak. That's why we call such arguments genuinely truth-preserving. They do not lose truth on the travel from premises to conclusions. In the case of an invalid argument, or one that has an incorrect or fallacious form, the truth can be lost on the way from premises to a conclusion. Now, sometimes you might get lucky. Maybe you have true premises, and it just happens to be the case that you wind up at a true conclusion. But that's not in virtue of the argument's shape. That's just a matter of luck, because invalid argument forms are such that, if you'll pardon the pun, they can't handle the truth. So there are several principles governing validity, and by the same token, governing invalidity. First of all, no middle ground, as we said earlier. Validity is all or nothing. And validity is not a matter of the truth values, the premises, or the conclusions. It's rather just a matter of the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. So here's a valid argument that has true premises and a true conclusion. That's a nice case. If all men are mortal, as the first premise claims, and Socrates is a man, as the second premise claims, Socrates is indeed mortal. But validity does not require true premises and a true conclusion, even though this structure is a very good one. You could have a valid argument in which you had false premises and a false conclusion, like this one. All television networks are terrorist organizations. NBC is a television network. Does it follow that NBC is a terrorist organization? Actually, yeah, it would. Basically, that would happen for all the same reasons as in the previous argument. If all television networks fall within the category of terrorist organizations, and NBC, at least this premise is true, is a television network, that puts NBC squarely in the blue container of terrorist organizations. Again, valid argument, and it doesn't matter whether the premises are true or false. It's a matter of the structure of this argument. Now here's an argument that's invalid, but it has true premises and a true conclusion. If all banks are financial institutions, we'll put our red circle here, right within the category of the blue circle. And premise 2 says Wells Fargo is a financial institution, but what does that tell us? It tells us that Wells Fargo goes somewhere in the blue. Does the conclusion follow that Wells Fargo is in the red bank category? That was not secured by these premises. Now this may be a little confusing. We have a true conclusion here. Is the argument still junk just because the reasoning or the inference was a bad or invalid one? And the answer here is yes. This junk argument could just as easily have led us to a falsehood in virtue of its bad form or bad shape. So if it does lead us to the truth, pretty much we're in the position of the proverbial blind squirrel getting lucky and finding a nut. Look at that argument once more. It's invalid and it has true premises and a true conclusion. Now notice what happens if I swap out the term banks, financial institutions, and Wells Fargo. How about instead squirrels, animals, and Socrates? Same type of argument, I just swapped out the terms in the red, blue, and black respectively. If all squirrels are animals and Socrates is an animal, does it follow that Socrates is a squirrel? Well, once again, this illustrates the point that these sorts of arguments are invalid precisely because they're unreliable. So deductive arguments, remember, are valid or invalid. Degree of support is 100% or 0. Trust them or don't. There's no middle ground. Now, soundness applies to a deductive argument when two conditions are met. Basically, to have a sound argument, you have to have a valid argument with all true premises. Now, in those cases, you have a great argument. An unsound argument is either invalid, it has a false premise, or it may fail on both counts. But soundness requires that both of the key elements of a deductive argument be satisfactorily met: strong inference, or appropriate inference, and true premise. Now, in order to see how our new and precise language applies to arguments, let's go back to an illustration that I've been using throughout this lecture series. All Vulcans are cannibals and Captain Kirk is a Vulcan. Is Captain Kirk a cannibal? Is there something illogical about this argument? Well, let's use more precise language now that we have it in hand. What we asked ourselves is whether Captain Kirk, if he was as described as the premises describe him, would be as the conclusion describes him as well. And the answer that we came up with there was yes, if all Vulcans are cannibals and Captain Kirk is a Vulcan, that would automatically make him a cannibal. So there is a sense in which the logic of this argument does hold up. It is a valid argument, we would say. But Spock can still take umbrage and say this argument is unsound. And the reason is, the argument contains false premises. Actually, both premises in that argument were false. Now let's take a look at a different example. What if we say all Vulcans are rational and Captain Kirk is rational? Now that, for those of you who buy into Star Trek lore, are true premises, right? But what about the conclusion that Captain Kirk is a Vulcan? Is there something illogical about this argument? Let's take a better look. Suppose we say that all Vulcans are rational, and then we say Captain Kirk is a rational being. Well, what happens then? If Captain Kirk is a rational being, that doesn't tell me whether or not he's a Vulcan. He could be anywhere in that red canister, and actually, he's in the part that does not include Vulcans. So in this case, again, the argument is unsound, but for a different reason. The premises are true, but the logic does not lead to the conclusion. The logic is deductively invalid. See how that works? Now, here's a question for you. Can a valid argument have a false conclusion? I want you to think about that a second. A valid argument, yes, can have a false conclusion, just in case it has false premises that you started with. But can a sound argument have a false conclusion? No, it cannot. Sound arguments always have true conclusions, so be careful not to call an argument sound unless you've looked at that conclusion really carefully. Sound arguments always have true conclusions because of two factors. The premises are true, it's admitted, and the structure of the argument is such that truth of the premises will be funneled down into the conclusion. You put those 2 points together, and that gets you to the result that sound arguments, in virtue of the true premises and the true or truth-preserving structure of the argument, will always have true conclusions. Now let's work down the left-hand side of the flowchart we were investigating earlier. Inductive inferences. Once you know you're dealing with an argument and you know it's inductive, what is the inference claim? The inference claim would be that the conclusion follows probably upon the premises. If that claim holds up, you call the inference a strong one. That means it's improbable for the conclusion to be false given the truth of the premises. On the other hand, if the inference claim does not hold up, then it's a weak inductive argument. That means the conclusion does not follow from the premises even though it's claimed to. So there are different principles that govern inductive strength. First of all, there are degrees of strength and weakness. It's not an all or nothing issue. But as with validity, the strength of the argument depends solely on a relationship between the premises and the conclusions. But lastly, and most importantly for us right now, additional premises will tend to strengthen or weaken the inference. So, the principle of total evidence that I'll talk about later applies uniquely in the case of inductive arguments. Consider this. This barrel contains 100 apples. 3 apples selected at random were found to be ripe. Can we reach the conclusion that probably all 100 apples were ripe? This is a case of a weak inductive inference. Now, by way of contrast, if this barrel contains 100 apples and 80 apples were selected at random and found to be right, then we have a pretty strong inference to the claim that all 100 apples were ripe. So in the first case, what we'd have to say is that we have a low degree of inductive strength. And in the second case, we'd say the degree of inductive strength was rather high. Now, strength of an argument does not depend upon truth of the premises or truth of the conclusion. Again, it's strictly a matter of the relationship of the information in the premises and conclusions. Consider this: all dinosaur bones found to this day have been at least 50 million years old. Therefore, probably the next dinosaur bone to be found will be at least 50 million years old. That's a strong argument, and the conclusions and premises are all true. Now here's another strong argument, but with false premises and a false conclusion. All comets found to this day have contained intelligent life forms. Therefore, probably the next comet to be found will contain intelligent life. Now you may be looking at that and wondering, why does that count as a strong inference? Well, for exactly the same reason as the previous example. They're the same style of argument. All found to this day have been a certain way, therefore probably the next will. So if the inference in the case of the dinosaurs was a strong inference, then you should see that the case of the comets involves a strong inference as well. So strength of inference has nothing to do with truth or falsity of the premises. It has to do with the relationship of the information found in the two. Now here's a weak argument that has all true premises and a true conclusion. Over the past 5 decades, the national debt has increased dramatically, and the U.S. will probably remain a leader in world trade for the next decade. Now, the premise is true, and the conclusion is true, but what's the relevance of one to the other? Here we have a weak link between the two, and consequently, not a very good argument. So cogency is a term kind of analogous to soundness that applies to an argument of the inductive sort when it is strong and when it has all true premises. If an argument of the inductive sort is strong and has all true premises, you call it cogent, and it becomes uncogent if it fails on one or both of these points, either by being weak or by having false premises, maybe both. Now, one last thing. Because inductive inferences have a different principle, namely the principle that additional premises can add or weaken support, we have a new principle that only applies in the inductive cases. That's called the principle of total evidence. Consider this. Swimming in the Caribbean is usually lots of fun. Premise: today the water is warm, the surf gentle, and, maybe as a further premise, on this beach there's no dangerous currents. Seems like we have a lot of evidence for the claim that it'd be fun to go swimming today, but you might find out that there's extra information regarding what's going on in these waters that would undermine that inference. So here's my 2 cents on what goes on in these sorts of cases, and it is the standard view on these scenarios. Inductive arguments that violate the principle of total evidence automatically count as weak arguments. Now that means that if you overlook evidence when you're filling out your premises that would have weakened the leap from premises to conclusions, if you overlook that evidence, your argument is automatically counted as a bad one in virtue of the weakness, the lack of strength in the inference. Now that should make sense to you if you think about it. Was the Caribbean swim argument a cogent argument? Well, that should be straightforward to answer. Absolutely not. It couldn't be cogent because cogency requires both a strong inference and it requires true premises. But did that argument have all true premises? Yes, it did. And that's a good reason for not starting out with the truth values of the premises as your standard for evaluating arguments. Look at the inference first. The overall similarity between soundness and cogency is this. For an argument to count of those sorts, you want a correct inference. Basically, you want the inference claim that was made to hold up, and you want all true premises. And unsound or uncogent arguments are the ones in which there's a bad inference, basically the inference claim being made did not hold up, or you have false premises, maybe both. So again, just to review, when you're evaluating arguments, check out whether or not they're inductive or deductive. Now, once you figure out the argument's type, then you can move on to decide whether or not the degree of strength claimed for the inference actually held up or failed to hold up. And if it did hold up, now you're in a position, last of all, to check out the truth value of the premises. And if you do that, Hopefully, you'll only end up accepting the good arguments, which are, respectively, the cogent arguments in the inductive case and the sound ones in the deductive case. So there are 3 issues that you have to work through, and logic is there to help you with the first 2, evaluating argument types and whether or not the inference claims hold up. Now, once you do that, as promised, it's all the little Plinko game. Is it an argument? If so, maybe deductive? Good inference? If yes, then check the premises, and if they hold up, you've got a sound argument. And a similar form of reasoning happens in the inductive case. If you follow these steps, hopefully you'll never be taken in by bad arguments. So that's all for now. It's quite a mouthful. So wait for my logic exercises on this video and, more importantly, my next lesson. You've got quite a lot to digest here, and if you ever watch one of my videos several times in a row, this is the one that I recommend for you. We'll see you guys next time, and we'll study fallacies. See you then. Bye-bye.